Thank you. Well, it's a treat to be with you, although I can't see you. So I assume there are people there. That laugh helped. So let me know. But it is always good to be here at the 92nd Street Y because it's such a wonderful audience. But I find myself in this position of, yet another book on women in history, and people keep asking me, why do you write these books? And it seems to me fairly obvious. I wear skirts, and I'm interested in what women were doing in the times of our past that were crucial, and I also do feel pretty strongly that leaving out half of the human race means that we've had a distorted history. But it is true, really, half the human race. But it is true that the main inspiration that I have had for all of these books was my mother, Lindy Boggs, who was first a congressional wife for many decades when my father, Hale Boggs, was in Congress, and then a member of Congress herself for almost 20 years. And then later in life, at the age of 81, she accepted a new job in a new country as the United States ambassador to the Vatican. And we were in the family very, very pleased when she was offered that job. She somewhat hesitated about taking it. And she said to me, actually, she said, I'm just not sure I want to leave my bed. And I said, well, I get that. There are lots of days I don't want to leave my bed. And she said, no, I mean my bed here. And meaning on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, which is where she lived. And she said, it's got the angels on it and everything. And I said, Mom, we're talking Vatican, We're not talking cherub free zone. But she then, we were, as I say, my brother and I were very pleased that she was going, that it was, going to be a great capstone to a career in public service where she could serve both her country and her church, and we'd get to go to Rome all the time. But then what happened in this country happened, and my mother found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Now think about it. It was hardest job in the diplomatic service. If anybody could do it, Mama could. And actually, President Clinton always says, the Pope liked me, and I'm sure that's true. But then she did come home to Bourbon Street, where she lived, and I mean smack dab in the middle of all of the honky-tonk on Bourbon Street. When our children were small, we'd walk past the strippers and the other neighbors, and I'd say, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. Then when she moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, I teased her that the costumes hadn't changed. It was still guys in dresses. But really, she has been the inspiration because I saw her throughout my life, both, and not just her, but all of her cronies, operating as highly, highly influential women when they had no titles of their own, and saw how much power they wielded, and then saw her move into a position where she did have the title and sometimes found herself less powerful because of the role of men. But it really has been the inspiration for doing all of these books. And I have loved writing about women in history because I've learned so much, and I think it's so crucial to the story of America. But honestly, I never, ever expected to do a Civil War book. All of my ancestors fought on the losing side. We can start there. But also, it's an awful war. Today we're commemorating the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln being shot. Oh, great. It's not something we really want to celebrate. So you have to say commemorate, and it's complicated and hard. And so I really never wanted to write about it, but my publisher really did want me to write about it. And so I started thinking, well, what's that going to be like? and I didn't even know what the book was going to be. I knew that I would love finding women's letters, because women's letters are so much better than men's letters. I mean, by leaps and bounds. You know, the men who, particularly in the founding period, but even in other periods in our history, understood, that men who were powerful, that their letters would be preserved and published. And so this is before you had private email servers, they wrote with that in mind. And so they would edit, and they would contemplate and make very careful utterances that were often quite pompous. The women's letters, on the other hand, are frank and funny and fresh and filled with all kinds of information, a lot of political news and a lot of political opinions, but also a tremendous amount of information about what's going on in society, who's having babies, who's unfortunately all too often losing children, fashions, all of it. They're just a much bigger picture of the history of the time, but they're also so wonderfully frank. And I knew that I would find something wonderful when I started reading women's letters. My personal favorite remains one that I found, because most of these letters have never been published before. I have to, dig them out and then find somebody to transcribe them and then read them and see what is worth publishing. And this one was one that I came upon that was written by Louisa Catherine Adams, the wife of John Quincy Adams. And it was a time when he was Secretary of State, but running for president. And she, by the way, talked about it was the fact that she considered it her vocation to get him elected president. So this is nothing new under the sun of women in this position. She wrote these wonderfully gossipy letters home to old John Adams. Abigail had died, and so she was trying to keep him amused. 1820 was the year of the Missouri Compromise, and Congress stayed in session much longer than it normally did because of hammering out the compromise. So finally they leave, and she goes that summer to a meeting of the trustees of the orphan asylum, where many of the political women served. Dolly Madison had founded it after the British invasion of Washington in 1814. So she goes to a meeting of the orphan asylum, and one of the women there says to her, "We're going to need a new building in the fall." And she says, "What are you talking about?" And the woman says to her, and I'm now quoting, "The session had been very long. The fathers of the nation had left 40 cases to be provided for by the public, and our institution was the most likely to be called upon to maintain this illicit progeny." Congress had left 40 pregnant women behind, and there were only about 200 members of Congress. Now, some of them might have been recidivist, I don't know, but anyway. So she writes, "I recommended a petition to Congress next session for that great and moral body to establish a foundling institution, and should certainly move that the $2 additional a day, which they have given themselves as an increase in pay, may be appropriated as a fund toward the support of the institution." Now, it doesn't get any better than that. It was, when I discovered that letter, I was just ecstatic. But so then I found, for this book, her daughter-in-law, Abigail Brooks Adams, who's married to Charles Francis Adams, who was in Congress and then became the Union ambassador to the Court of St. James, and really kept the British from allying themselves with the Confederacy. She was briefly in Washington while he was in Congress, and it was the infamous 36th Congress, which was the one that seceded. And she wrote these letters home to her son, Henry Adams, and again, they have never been published, and I was just reading them, getting wider and wider-eyed, as she referred to President Buchanan as a heavy old toad, and said, that the Senate behaved like children, and silly ones at that, which I could totally get behind. And then she said, at one point, I would advise any young woman who wishes to have an easy, quiet life not to marry an Adams. So I figured, well, this could be all right. But I didn't get to her letters until I figured out what the book was going to be about. And I started thinking about how World War II had changed the role of women in America and changed the role of Washington in America. And I had actually witnessed the aftermath of that as a child, growing up in Washington in the 1940s and 50s. On the mall now, the Grand National Mall, there were at that point what were called temporary buildings. They had been there for a long time. They were sort of Quonset hut type buildings. And they were there from World War I and then World War II because of the expansion of government. And the expansion of government had also greatly expanded the role of women in government, with the government girls coming into Washington to work in World War II. And of course, we all know the story now because thankfully we've finally had decent educational materials about Rosie the Riveter going to work in the munitions factories and the airplane factories and all of that. And and of course, also after World War II, there were all the movements towards an ERA and equal pay and all of those things. Actually, today is Equal Pay Day. But so I started wondering if something similar was the case with the Civil War. And of course, it turns out it was. And so I started concentrating on the area that I know best, which is Washington, and seeing how it had changed during the war and how women's roles there had changed. And I especially concentrated on the political women because, again, they're the people I know best and they're the people who I found most interesting. But I also found lots of other unheralded similarities. There was a Rosie the Riveter. There were women who worked in arsenals and did incredibly dangerous work. They were stuffing cartridges, and in Washington, and actually in a couple of other places, there were these horrendous arsenal explosions. And in Washington, a couple of dozen women were killed. And the newspaper accounts are just chilling because they talk about they couldn't identify them. Someone was identified by her shoes, but they saw that they were all trapped in their hoop skirts because going to work in the arsenal, they were still dressed as proper ladies in their hoops, and they sort of got them caught in them. And then there were also government girls. Women who came to Washington to make a living. The men were off at war. And they got there just as the Congress had passed a law allowing the printing of paper money to pay for the war. Then, as now, actually still true, the money comes off the printing press in these huge sheets, and of course now it's cut up by machines. Then people had to sit there with scissors and cut each bill out separately. And the Treasurer of the United States, General Skinner, said, well, I'm hiring women for this because he said, first of all, they're cheap. Something NPR has felt ever since. And he said, but they're much better with scissors than men are. And so women came to work in the government, and by the end of the war, they were in every government department. And Mary Climmer Ames, one of the journalists who was covering Washington at the time and later, said by the end of the war, there were women of education in every department of government. And of course, they never went home. They stayed there. So it was a time of tremendous change. Mary Climmer Ames, is also emblematic of a group of women who came to Washington and stayed during the war, which is reporters. And some of them were just unbelievably delightful. There was a woman named Mary Jane Wendell who wrote mainly for Southern newspapers, and she would write these wonderful little missives. They were all covering Congress. Talk about feeling connected, and so she would write about sort of goings on behind the columns and all of that, and she's writing about the last day of Congress, and she's looking down and she sees a member of Congress searching frantically through heaps of papers until he found what he was looking for. It was a lady's handwriting. The sight of this seemed to inspire reverie, for he sat several moments with a vague and abstracted dreaminess of eye. It is not necessary to tell our readers that this honorable is a bachelor member. And so then she says nearby is a married member who unsentimentally collected a pile of letters from his absent wife. For him, the sentiment of romance of life is ended. So, it's a different take on the Congress of the time, and it was great fun to read. But a lot of these women reporters were also activists. They were abolitionists and suffragists, like Jane Swisshelm, who was the first woman to report from the Capitol Press Gallery. She got permission to do so from the then Vice President Millard Fillmore. But no sooner was she admitted in than she was thrown out, because she wrote that Daniel Webster had a drinking problem, and she claimed that he also had black children, and she broke what was the boys on the bus rule, which many female journalists have been breaking ever since, which was that you don't tell what's going on, really. You just tell what they debate about, but you don't tell who they are and what they do. And I remember obviously many decades later, 100 years later, having a conversation once on the Brinkley Show, where we were talking about this question of covering candidates, and their characters and how they treated women and all that. And I said, well, what sometimes happens now that you have women on the bus is they come home and talk about it to the wives of the men on the bus. And this look of just total panic was on my fellow panelists' faces. I mean, really, they just, and one of my colleagues is in the control room, timed it, and she said, 45 seconds of total silence. They were so undone. So that hasn't changed. And then there were women that we do know about, that I learned about, but we think we know about them, but I certainly didn't know all about them. Women like Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton. Dorothea Dix, we know, was a wonderful advocate for mental health, for people who had mental illness, and building hospitals to serve them. But in the 1840s, she came to Washington to lobby for the federal government putting aside 12 million acres of land for the impoverished and the ill, saying it's our land anyway. And she'd get one House of Congress to pass it, then another House of Congress to pass it, and she finally did get both Houses of Congress to pass it, and then President Pierce vetoed it. But she was so well respected and had such influence that the Senate gave her an office in the Capitol from which to work and to do her lobbying. And she did succeed in establishing a government hospital for the insane, it was called. It's still there. It's St. Elizabeth's. John Hinckley is still there. And she was just a remarkable human being who ended up establishing more than 100 hospitals for the mentally ill, 32 state hospitals, 2 in Japan, and of course during the war headed the female nurses for the Union Army. They had never been female nurses. The war brought women into the medical profession, really. There had been a couple of doctors here, Elizabeth Blackwell and her sister, and Dr. Mary Walker, who showed up to volunteer for the Union Army, and she is still the only woman to have won the Medal of Honor. I know. So I learned a lot more about Dorothea Dix. Clara Barton, I knew, I knew the sobriquet, that she was the angel of the battlefield, but the battlefield was incredible to learn about. The work she did. She had worked as a teacher and then railed against the fact that men made more and ended up working in the patent office. And then when the war came, started collecting supplies, and the quartermaster realized that she had a treasure trove. It allowed her to go out to the front and deliver her supplies. And then she started nursing, and the stories are hair-raising. But then after the war, she goes to Europe and discovers something called the Red Cross. And then, this is one of the things that makes me crazy. The history books say, and then she established the American Red Cross. Oh, really? Did it just sort of happen overnight? Was it hard? It's like, and then women got the right to vote, and so she ended up lobbying Congress for decades until they finally the Senate finally ratified the Geneva Conventions. And this is still the Geneva Conventions we're still talking about today in terms of treatment of prisoners and allowing neutral parties onto battlefields. And getting that ratified by the Senate was really almost entirely a one-woman operation, and that woman was Clara Barton. So, I learned about women I knew, but I learned a lot more about them. Women I didn't know, the reporters and the munitions workers and the government workers. But I was most interested, because I always am, in the political women. And they turned out to be just incredibly fascinating, and just one after another. And I tried to concentrate on sort of a few from the North and a few from the South, but it was hard to leave people out. Jessie Benton Fremont is one of the most interesting. Her father, Thomas Hart Benton, was a senator from Missouri for many years, an anti-slavery senator from Missouri, and she grew up very involved in politics, and then ran off with the swashbuckling explorer John Fremont, much to her father's dismay. And Fremont started exploring more and more, ends up in California, says to her, come to California. And now she's on her way to go to California. It's 1849. They discover gold. And she gets on a ship here. And this is, again, she went to California, you say. Going to California was, incredible, right? She gets with her 6-year-old daughter on a ship here in New York, and it's jammed with gold diggers. And off they go down to Panama. Then they have to cross the isthmus. Of course, there's no canal. And it's dangerous and disease-ridden. And she, as a personage, is treated quite well, but still, she's sick and it's awful. And at one point, she's served a baked monkey, and she says it looked like nothing so much as a charred child, And then there are no ships to come pick her up and take her to San Francisco, because anytime a ship got to San Francisco, all the crew jumped ship to go search for gold. And so finally, a ship comes in, and she and her daughter go now up the coast to San Francisco, and they get there, and there are not more than 4 or 5 substantial houses. There's 16 women in the whole town, and so it's all just such a story. And she then becomes a state. John Fremont becomes one of the first senators. So back to Washington they go, where she was thrilled. But then comes the 1856 election, and he is the first Republican nominee for president. The brand new Republican Party nominates John C. Fremont. She had written to her good friend Elizabeth Blair Lee in Washington that they were living in New York, and she said, my neighbors see a presidentess among them. And she said, and I wear purple, to make it clear. But so the campaign starts, and she is right in the front of it. There's no behind the scenes. There's no pretense that she's, really the little lady sitting at home. None of that. She is right front and center. All the posters are Fremont and Jesse, the vice president, forgotten completely, and forgotten by me still. And it got to such a point where one of the Democratic papers running against Fremont had this suggestion in an editorial that the campaign should say, "For president, John C. Fremont," in tiny little letters, "husband of Jesse Benton," you know. And so she was there. And then the war began, and he was a general, and she was running everything. She was called, not admiringly, General Jessie. And Fremont got in trouble with Lincoln, and she takes a train from Missouri to Washington and goes marching into the White House and makes demands of Lincoln. And that's what these women kept doing. I couldn't get over it. They were always walking into the White House browbeating presidents. It was really something to behold. And so, you know, you sort of got to know them with more and more admiration. And one of the ones I really liked the best was Verena Davis, who was the wife of Jefferson Davis. They had a touchy marriage. He did always want her to go home and be the dutiful wife, and she was dutiful. She did everything she was supposed to do, but she was independent, and she was always sort of chafing at his trying to put her in a box. But he needed her desperately, and for a while she was the foremost woman in Washington, because there was a period in there, for a variety of reasons, there was basically no first lady, and she was the primary first lady for a while. And after that 1856 election, she got very upset because these women at this point were all vying for chief belldom, bellhood. They called themselves bells. And one of them that they all sort of elevated to the number one spot was a woman who had no husband or father or anybody who was powerful, Adele Cutts. And her great aunt was Dolly Madison, who was the most powerful person for about a half century. And everybody loved her. She was smart, she was beautiful, she was nice. And so then, after that 1856 election, everybody suddenly discovers that she's going to marry, Adele Cutts is going to marry Stephen Douglas. And he's much older, and the women really did not like him. I mean, it's so great to read other people's mail. And so Verena Davis writes home to her mother and says that she is horrified that her friend Adele is going to marry the dirty speculator and party trickster, broken in health by drink, with his first wife's money, buys an elegant, well-bred woman because she is poor and her father is proud. And so Verena says, it's a good thing that there's a new water system coming to Washington, so sparing his wife's olfactories, Douglas may wash a little oftener. If he don't, his acquaintances will build larger rooms with more perfect ventilation. I mean, now we know that Stephen Douglas stank, and we only learn that in women's letters. The men don't talk about it. But she does turn out to be one of the most interesting women in the book. And all through the war, even though she was the first lady of the Confederacy and all of that, she stayed very close with her Northern friends, particularly Elizabeth Blair Lee, as in Blair House. Lizzie Lee's father, Francis Preston Blair, had been in Jackson's kitchen cabinet and then was a confidant of Lincoln. Her brother, Montgomery Blair, was in Lincoln's cabinet. Her brother, Frank Blair, was in the Congress. And her husband, Phillips Lee, was a cousin of Robert E. Lee, but was in the Union Navy. And because he was in the Navy, she wrote to him every day. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters. And thankfully, some of them have even been put together in a book. But her letters are very, very descriptive of Washington during the war, where you get a real sense of the incredible danger that the city was in, and how, at any moment the South might attack. And you also see, similarly to the World War II, the government growing and expanding through the war. And of course, the main character at that point is Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was a very controversial creature. And at one point, she was accused of leaking the State of the Union message to the New York Herald in exchange for favorable coverage, because they covered her like a cheap suit, and and not favorably, most of the papers. And Congress actually investigated this, and the president had to go to Capitol Hill and say, please don't embarrass me by investigating my wife and bringing her up here. So since it was a Congress of the same party, they dropped it, but that was there as it is today. And Mary Lincoln, because she was very unpopular with the women of Washington, I think this is the main reason, became a very close confidant of a woman who worked for her, Elizabeth Keckley, who had been a slave and bought her freedom and was a highly talented couturier, a dressmaker. She made all of the prominent women's dresses, including Varina Davis's. And so when Mrs. Lincoln came to town, she wanted to hire her. And Lizzie Keckley heard every conversation, or many conversations between Abraham and Mary Lincoln. She cared for Willie Lincoln as he was dying, and then Mary Lincoln after he died. And then she cared for Mary Lincoln again after Lincoln died. And she also heard Mrs. Lincoln just go off on members of Lincoln's cabinet. And then she wrote a tell-all book. And, again, there's one right now in the stores of White House staffers that everybody's shocked that they wrote. Well, Lizzie Keckley did it first. And, of course, it ruptured the relationship with Mary Lincoln, but she really did tell a story that gives us an insight into that relationship in that White House that nothing else does. She was also though, very keen to take care of the escaped and then freed slaves who came to Washington, and established a social welfare organization to do that. And that was true of a lot of these women, particularly after the war ended. Women who had called themselves belles and had been politically interested and interesting suddenly became political activists and journalists and social welfare activists in their own rights. So Varina Davis, after Jefferson Davis dies, moves to New York. Great scandal in the Confederacy. The First Lady of the Confederacy is moving to New York. She had always been somewhat at odds with her Southern sisters, and one of the sources of contention was that she was not fair-complected enough for a true Southern belle. And when everybody had a fit that she was moving to New York, she wrote to her daughter and said, "I am free, brown, and 64. I can do whatever I want to do." And then she moved here. She wrote for the New York World and had a salon at the Majestic Hotel. But she also befriended Julia Grant, the wife of Ulysses S. Grant, and the two of them were very aware that what they were doing was bringing about reconciliation after this bitter, horrible, horrendous war where more than 600,000 Americans lost their lives. And she very purposefully went to the dedication of the Grant Memorial to show this sense of reconciliation. And similarly, Virginia Clay, who is a delightful Southern belle through the lead up to the war, and she then wrote a book about herself called A Belle of the 50s, then becomes a very ardent suffragist and shows up on platforms with Horace Greeley and Mrs. William Lloyd Garrison, people her husband fought bitterly before the war. But again, bringing people back together, reconciliation and activism born out of their experiences in the war. Another Southerner, Sarah Pryor, also moved to New York. Her husband became a Superior Court judge here, a Confederate general. And she became a highly revered writer, but also started a variety of social service and relief organizations, and helped with Lizzie Lee, but who had stayed loyal to the North, found the Daughters of American Revolution to get back to the period when the country was all united. So it was a very interesting sense of the women trying to bring the country back together at the end of this horrendous conflict. But they were doing it with new powers and talents that they had honed as a result of the war. And Clara Barton wrote in a Memorial Day address. Sarah Pryor helped create Memorial Day. She wrote in a Memorial Day address a couple of decades later that woman was at least 50 years in advance of the normal position which continued peace would have assigned her. So as we commemorate this complicated time at the end of this horrible war, that is something to celebrate. So thank you for letting me share that with you, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Likely to spill that water. First question is, did you ever consider running for political office, Congress? Why or why not? I am the only member of my original nuclear family not to run for Congress. Now, they didn't all win. The only person in the family who never lost an election was my mother. But I met my husband when I was 18 years old and he was 19, and he was always going to be a journalist. So it would have been very hard on him if I had gone into politics. But I have to tell you, I've always felt guilty about it. I have tremendous respect and admiration for the people who put themselves on the line to serve the public. And I really, the only kind of excuse I can give myself, other than my husband, who's an excuse for a lot of things, but is that I do feel that I've tried over the decades to inform people about the workings of government so that they can be informed voters, which is also a form of public service, I think. Does gender inequality still exist in the United States? Oh, please. Yes. Okay, now, moving right along. Were there any accounts of women in the Civil War splitting with their husbands over ideological difference regarding slavery? Yes and no. What you get is women certainly thinking that the whole idea of creating a confederacy and trying to become a separate country is fool's play, that it's not winnable. Verena Davis is very clear on that at the beginning of the war. And then in terms of slavery, I've always sort of thought this might be true, and then I did find it written down by Mary Chesnut. And I do not include her in this book except for this one quotation because I feel that her diaries have been well mined. But she writes at one point that she had always thought that slavery was like marriage. And I had always theorized that women thought that because, of course, married women could not own property. And so they became the property of their husbands. I mean, if you got married with a necklace, that necklace became your husband's necklace. You did not own property. And so I had a theory that maybe women thought that it was similar. Not all women, obviously, and Abigail Adams railed against slavery from the beginning. But I think people had grown up with it and sort of saw it as a way of life to the degree that they thought about it at all, which I think some didn't, was that there was this sense of, well, I'm owned too. And Mary Chesnut actually articulated that until she went to a slave auction and saw how horrible it was. And she was just blown away by the just the terror of it. But then she said, but the Bible, the Bible allows slavery and the Bible allows marriage. Oh, poor women, oh, poor slaves. So there was this sense that we're all in it. But she understood that there was a very substantial difference, and I think that the women over the course of time came to understand it more and more and more. And of course, many of them were ardent abolitionists before the war and got involved in things like journalism or the creation of freedmen's societies and all of that in order to promote, because they had always been there, that they had always been adamantly anti-slavery. If it was 50 years from now, which woman would you find fascinating? I assume that means modern political women. I would find them all fascinating. I'm never a good one about who's best, who's worst, who's any of that, because people are all so different from each other. And I'm that way about interviews too. Who's your best interview, who's your worst interview? Best interviews tend to be, women with curlers in shopping malls who tell you things, just like these women tell you in their letters, as opposed to politicians who have been, media trained within an inch of their lives and answer in 9-second sound bites. So, people say, who would you most like to interview? It isn't a politician. It's somebody who actually has something they're willing to tell you. So I think that I would say about the women serving in office now, which I assume that's geared at, that I find different ones of them fascinating in different ways. I do still think it's true that the most powerful woman in the land is the First Lady, more so than a female Secretary of State, because, it has to do with the relative power of the man. And somebody who has that kind of influence over the President of the United States is a very powerful person. Now, which gets us, of course, to, are you surprised that we have not had a female president yet? No, that gets back to, is there still gender discrimination? I'm not surprised, I'm disappointed. I certainly hope we have one before I die. And maybe we'll have one in the next election cycle. I think that Hillary Clinton's chances are very, very good. She has a lot of things working for her in addition to her own smarts and all of that, which is demography. The Republicans have done a good job in alienating large chunks of the population, and it's a real problem for them. Because at this point, they have turned off African Americans, Hispanics, young people, gay people. And what Hillary Clinton gets in addition to that is white women. Now, that can change in the course of a long campaign. But right now, that's where she is. And most Democrats do not get white women. So the fact that she has that group at the moment in the polls supporting her is a very good predictor for her. On the other hand, she's running against herself. It would be easier to run against another candidate, and then you'd have a comparison. So she has to do an awful lot of walking a balance beam of exactly how she works this campaign. And as you've seen, now she's in Iowa, and where she wasn't 4 years or 8 years ago. And I think that that's a smart thing to do. I also think that, getting us to know baby Charlotte is also wise, actually. And wise is the word, because there's going to be a certain amount of conversation about her age. And I'm older than she is, so I can say this. And but I think that pointing out that older women have wisdom is something that people might find very comforting. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But, the fact that we haven't had a female president, and people always say, for heaven's sakes, Bangladesh has. The truth is that in most cases, the women who have come to power, now this is not true of Golda Meir or Margaret Thatcher, but it is of many of the women who have come to power, is that they have come as a relation to some man. But in every case, it has been a parliamentary system. And it is really easier to be named head of your party and have your party elected than it is to have this single, very, it really is unique vote for this person, and it is a person vote for president, than it is to elect a party. And so I think that is one of the reasons the U.S. has not had a female head of state when other countries have. Who do you think is the most likely choice to be Hillary's running mate? Beats the hell out of me. I think out of her too. That is, that we are so far away from that, that it's, if I were she, I would be going, don't talk about a running mate until we're a whole lot closer to a nomination. So I think that that's way down the pike, and of course it will be in large part determined by whomever the Republican nominee is, and that is really up for grabs, and which makes it, of course, for people like me, a tremendous amount of fun, because we don't often have an election where we don't have a clue what the outcome is, and so that is going to be something that is going to be fascinating to behold and to see, because it really is a party at the moment at war in terms of what kind of Republican Party they want to present to the country. And you still have people in, quote unquote, the establishment part of the party, whatever that is, saying, you can't elect one of these people in the extremes because they'll lose in the general election. And the other people in the party saying to them quite correctly in terms of fact, well, great, you've been nominating those folks all along and they haven't won. So that's where the battle's going to come. And it's not, though, just between the establishment to a large degree at this point represented by Jeb Bush, but which conservative? Is it the libertarian? Is it the religious one? Is it the conservative without the religious overlay? So, that's going to be an ongoing battle that'll get played out in the primaries, and it will be something really interesting to behold. And the hook is coming. So, okay, one more, but I don't have another one here. I've answered everything you've given me. Okay, but so thank you very, very much. It's lovely to be with you. Thank you.